Today we're going to be focusing in on water resources and how it is that we might damage those resources by polluting them. So we'll take a look at what sorts of materials count as pollutants and how they get into aquatic systems. We'll also consider what the consequences are of polluting these systems. Before we turn our attention to water resources, however, there's still one last issue under the heading of air pollution that we need to talk about, and that is what kinds of things can be done to clean up air after it's gone through some sort of an industrial process, or after air is coming out of a power plant. One sort of device that's used is called an electrostatic precipitator, and you can see an illustration of one here in this federally prepared diagram of an air pollution control system. Precipitator works a bit like a photocopier in that an electrical charge is used to remove particulates from air. So once something like coal is burned, any particulates remaining in the exhaust air can be pulled out using this precipitator and then accumulated as a substance called fly ash. And then the fly ash can be sent to an ash landfill, or it can also be sent to recycling kinds of processes. Another device that's used is called a scrubber, which you can also see in this illustration. It uses a spray of water to help cleanse materials out of exhaust air, often in association also with limestone, which can be used to help pull materials out of exhaust air as well. So once air has gone through this electrostatic precipitator and scrubber system, then what's left over is sent up the smokestack, and it tends to be much cleaner than what went in. Maybe not completely free of all pollutants, but with pollutant concentrations greatly reduced. Let's start out with some definitions. We can talk about sources of water pollution being of two principal types. Point sources are materials that enter waterways from a single spot, like a pipe coming out of a factory or something like that. Whereas non-point sources are sources of pollution that enter waterways across a broader front. Let's take a look at some examples. As we look down on this aerial view of the New York City area, we are looking upon a whole host of different sorts of water pollution sources, from point sources coming out of some of those factories in the foreground to non-point sources like all those high-rise buildings in the background. In the foreground, you're looking at the area where the Hackensack and Passaic rivers join to form Newark Bay. Let's go take a closer look at this particular area. This is just a little bit further down past the last photograph to the area where the rivers join to form Newark Bay. This photograph is from the early 1970s. And back in those days, Newark Bay was one of the most heavily polluted bodies of water in the world. I can remember standing at this spot here, looking down at water that looked more like syrup than water. It was so filled with all sorts of materials from a whole variety of different kinds of factories and other sorts of sources. Here is that same general vicinity today from the air. Although the bay is still far from being clean, it is much less polluted now than it was back 40 years ago. In fact, in the wintertime now, you can even find flocks of ducks overwintering in Newark Bay. And the green areas that you're looking at are some of the Hackensack meadowland marshes that are at the upper reaches of Newark Bay, where the rivers actually enter the bay. And these areas, in many instances, have today been set aside as wildlife areas, and indeed they have quite a few kinds of animals that live in them. Now, one of the issues that Newark Bay deals with to this day is that of sewage. Although much of the sewage which enters the bay now is treated by sewage treatment plants, there's still a significant amount of nutrients that are being added to this system. Wastewater is typically rich in nitrates and phosphates. So is things like liquids from septic systems make their way through the soil into bodies of water like Newark Bay. They're bringing these kinds of nutrients with them. And so it's essentially like fertilizing the water, which leads to growth of algae populations. And once you get this going on, all those algae eventually start dying back and get eaten by bacteria. They are going to remove oxygen from the water. Bacterial decomposition of algae as these algal blooms die off, that increases what is called biological oxygen demand on the system. And what that means in practical terms is that a lot of oxygen gets used by bacteria to carry on their metabolic processes in breaking down these dead remains. So that will suck oxygen out of water and leave it a low oxygen or no oxygen system. So much of Newark Bay would qualify as a low oxygen system. And back in the 1970s, much of the area would have even had no oxygen available for aquatic organisms. So not surprisingly, if there's no oxygen in the water, then all kinds of organisms that need oxygen can no longer be present. So this would include most kinds of fish. There are indeed some kinds of fish that will tolerate very low oxygen conditions, but most species, particularly the commercially important ones, cannot. What we would also see in a low oxygen system would be a dramatic change in the kinds of invertebrates present. Many of the kinds of aquatic insects and other kinds of aquatic organisms that are present in oxygen-rich aquatic systems would also be absent from environments like this. And this is even before we take into account other classes of pollutants that might be in that water. Now, by and large, the kinds of effluent that you would find coming out of the septic systems from houses like you see in the background here, or for that matter, even the bathrooms on the boats that you see in the foreground, that is material that's associated with human waste. And so not only does this effluent contain nitrogen and phosphorus and other kinds of agents that would act to fertilize aquatic systems, but also the bacterial flora of human intestines makes its way into these waterways by these sorts of sources. This intestinal bacterium is Escherichia coli, or it's usually referred to as E. coli for short. And this is present in the intestines of many kinds of animals. And it's certainly present in our intestines, and it's an essential resident there. Without E. coli, our digestive process doesn't work as well as it does with it. Now, some of the strains of E. coli are pathogenic, however, and these can lead to a variety of different kinds of gastrointestinal disorders if you become exposed to them. The presence of E. coli in water is an indicator of water contamination with fecal material. And there are tests that are made on water to determine whether or not it has been contaminated with fecal material. This is the so-called fecal coliform test. Now, nutrient-rich kinds of aquatic systems that have lots of nitrogen and phosphorus entering them and may also have E. coli present in the water. These kinds of systems are, as a group, referred to as eutrophic systems. Systems that are experiencing an influx of nutrients and things like that are often referred to as undergoing eutrophication. And what we're looking at here is a eutrophic kind of a pond, which is characteristic in many ways of this kind of situation. Nutrient-rich water, low oxygen levels, water temperatures rather high, and lots of aquatic vegetation growing on the surface. In the water, we also would find lots of algae growing. At the other end of the spectrum, we might find an aquatic system like this one here, characterized by low nutrients and lower water temperatures and rather clear water without a lot of aquatic vegetation and algae and that sort of thing in it. These kinds of systems are referred to as oligotrophic systems, and within them we find many of our more economically valuable species of fish. Many of our most valuable fish prefer cold, lower nutrient water, high in oxygen. So again, to summarize, oligotrophic systems are those that tend to be low in nutrients with clear, oxygen-rich, often cold water that supports a lower density of aquatic organisms, but in many ways higher quality kinds of aquatic organisms. So some of our most valuable fish species like trout and pike and so on, and an aquatic invertebrate community characterized by things like mayflies and stoneflies, kinds of organisms that also require high oxygen kinds of systems. Eutrophic systems, once again, are systems that are high in nutrients with high densities of aquatic photosynthetic organisms. They're low in oxygen. The water is often kind of cloudy. That's called turbidity. They're often shallow with warmer water, and instead of having fish species like trout and pike, you might find species like catfish, which are more tolerant of these kinds of conditions. And instead of aquatic invertebrates like mayflies, you might find midge larvae, especially certain kinds of midge larvae, also known as chironomids, which are capable of living in low oxygen situations. They actually are blood red when you see them. They carry their own hemoglobin with them and are able to extract the little bit of oxygen there is in the water out with this. Leeches, which are also tolerant of low oxygen situations, you can find things like that. So in many kinds of ways, they're lower quality kinds of aquatic systems. Now let's turn our attention to another issue in water quality, and that has to do with sediments, suspended particles in water. What we're looking at here is the Blackstone River. And Blackstone River was one of the first industrial rivers in America. It flows through eastern Massachusetts and into Rhode Island. And once upon a time, there were quite a few thread mills along this river, pretty much all of which are gone now. Well into the 20th century, the Blackstone was a heavily polluted river from these kinds of industries that in many cases had pipes that just dumped their effluent right into the rivers. All sorts of dyes and things like that. People will tell you stories about the Blackstone being different colors on different days of the week and things like that. Today, however, like Newark Bay, it is a cleaner body of water than it once was. And in fact, if we examine the chemistry of the river, you can again find modest levels of dissolved oxygen. It still tends to have a community of organisms that are dominated by species that are more characteristic of eutrophic systems, however. So you do find leeches and chironomids and not all that many mayflies and stoneflies and things like that in it. One thing you may notice about this photograph is that despite the fact that the river is now cleaner than it used to be, it still has kind of brown water. The brown is associated with sediment that's suspended in the water column. That sediment is a consequence of human activity further upriver, destabilizing soils which then can erode into the river and be carried by it downstream. Heavy sediment loads are not a very good thing for organisms that live in water. Fish that have to breathe water through their gills can have all the sediment interfere with that. And the same is true of many kinds of aquatic invertebrates. Lots of sediment in the water tends to, in many cases, not be a good thing for them. In quieter water areas along waterways, this sediment can precipitate out of the water column, however. So in backwaters of rivers and things like that, the sediments can accumulate like you see in this photograph here. In the foreground, we're looking at a mudflat, and in the background, we're looking at portions of that mudflat that have become colonized by marsh plants of various species. So not all aspects of sediment being carried by watercourses is a bad thing. And indeed, especially along our larger rivers, water carrying sediment has always been a part of these systems. It's why along large rivers you often find marshes like these that you see here. And of course, these marshes form habitat for a whole variety of semi-aquatic species. We can summarize some of these sorts of observations about sediments like this. Sediments enter water via erosion from the land, in most instances because vegetation cover has been disturbed and therefore the soil can be washed into rivers. Agricultural activities will do this. Construction activities will do this. But you can also have natural processes doing this, such as the erosion of riverbanks by the movement of water along the riverbanks. As we increase the amount of sediment in the water, we increase the water's turbidity, and this reduces the light penetration into the water. It also can cause issues, as we've discussed, in terms of organisms that need to breathe the water and get oxygen out of it. If there is a good deal of sediment that can interfere with oxygen extraction and also feeding by some of these kinds of organisms. Lots of sediments can interfere with the filter feeding mechanisms of clams, for example. Let's turn our attention back to those nutrients that we were talking about earlier, notably nitrates and particularly phosphates. These kinds of things are important nutrients for aquatic systems. Often the one that is in limited supply at aquatic systems is phosphorus. So activities that tend to increase phosphorus levels in water, those are the ones that can have the most kind of impact on the quality of water in aquatic systems. So it's not enough for water to be rich in nitrogen to fuel an algal bloom, for example. The real key is having enough phosphorus also available. And then once enough phosphorus is available, then aquatic productivity can greatly increase. Principal sources for these kinds of nutrients, these major nutrients, also referred to as macronutrients, would be human activities in many cases, such as agricultural activities. Chicken manure, for example, is very rich in phosphorus, and so a chicken farm next to a river can wind up putting a lot of phosphorus into an aquatic system as rain carries some of those nutrients from the land into the adjacent water. Farmland that has chemical fertilizer applied to it, if it's applied excessively, more than the crops can use, then the leftover phosphorus and nitrogen is going to make its way into aquatic systems eventually as rain carries it through soil and deposits it in these systems. And again, as I've mentioned previously, septic systems associated with homes can input lots of nitrogen and phosphorus into a system. That's why houses built adjacent to lakes can often have an inordinate impact on the quality of the water of the lake that they're adjacent to. In many lake communities, there are laws that restrict what kind of septic input a house can have if it's built adjacent to a lake. Now, nutrients and sediments are not the only sorts of pollution issues facing aquatic systems. There's quite a few other kinds of chemicals that can also negatively impact these systems. We can divide them into two major groups: the organic chemicals and the inorganic chemicals. Organic chemicals would be carbon-containing compounds, many of them synthetic in nature. Things like pesticides used in agriculture, including some of the major classes of pesticides that are used on agricultural lands, like the carbamates and chlorinated hydrocarbons and organophosphates. Chlorinated hydrocarbons have been largely phased out because they are too persistent in the environment, whereas carbamates and organophosphates tend to be more short-lived. Although as they break down, again, they're putting phosphorus and things like that into systems. Other kinds of organic chemicals might include industrial chemicals like PCBs, plastics, gasoline, oil, things like that, whereas inorganic pollutants might include things like lead and mercury. Here is a U.S. Geological Survey map of organic pollutants in groundwater, and notice that especially particular parts of the U.S. are affected. The northeastern U.S. has among the highest concentrations of these kinds of organics in the water. Although notice also along the Mississippi River and in southern Florida and in southern California, as well as in the Central Valley of California, you have additional areas of higher concentration. Here's a close-up of the northeastern part of the U.S. to examine that corridor of particular pollution in a bit more detail. You can see, especially in that New York to Boston corridor, that there are quite a number of locations where groundwater is significantly contaminated by various types of organic chemicals. Considering the high population density in this area and the high density of industry in this area, it's not terribly surprising that that would be the case. Here's still another U.S. Geological Survey map documenting contamination of groundwater, in this case not with organics but an inorganic substance, arsenic. And you can see that certain parts of the country are far more affected than other parts of the country with this particular pollutant. Notice that there's quite a bit in the southwest, for example, although it again appears in parts of the northeast. Here's one last USGS map, in this case illustrating vulnerability to nitrate pollution across the U.S. Notice that the most vulnerable areas are in the Midwest. Nitrates are often associated with agriculture, either production of crops or livestock, and so much of the breadbasket of the country, a lot of our most extensive agricultural areas are in this region where nitrate pollution is a significant factor. So let's close today with this map, and we will continue on with our discussion of pollution next time.